Hi, this is Scott. I really appreciate our sponsors because they make the show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Developer Express. Become a UI superhero with Dev Express controls and libraries. Deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today. By leveraging your existing knowledge, you can build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. You can download your free 30-day trial at dx.hanselminutes.com. That's dx.hanselminutes.com. Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today I'm talking with Amanda Silver. She's the Partner Director of Program Management at Microsoft. How long have you been at Microsoft?
Since 2001.
Doing my quick math, 16 years?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a long time.
You and I got to work on a demo together at the Connect conference. It's this conference that we do every year in New York, and we demoed this thing called Visual Studio Live Share.
Yep.
What is it and why is it cool?
So the idea behind Live Share is that you might want to collaborate with another developer in real time, but you want to use your tools to do it. So rather than using screen sharing or some other kind of mechanism, you can basically take your familiar tools, Visual Studio or VS Code, and connect to the other person's workspace remotely. And you can actually look at all of their files and make some edits and make some, possibly debug together, so you can work on bugs and collaborate in real time.
Now, that on its face, that sounds like Google Docs for code.
Yeah, and a lot of people try to make that analogy, and in a way, it is from an experience perspective, but from an implementation perspective, it's actually the wrong analogy. Mm-hmm. More like a Skype is actually more kind of appropriate, and it's kind of.
Okay. But it's not screen sharing, though.
It's not screen sharing. That's right. It's so in a Google Docs kind of a model. Mm-hmm. Basically, that's like there's a common document that both of you guys are working on that's hosted in the cloud, right?
Oh, so neither of you have the document locally in that scenario.
Potentially. I mean, it might be that you have a local copy, but that there's basically the master lives in the cloud.
Okay.
Right? And so both of you are operating on the master that's in the cloud.
Okay.
In this model with Live Share, we could have hosted the source code in the cloud, but that actually comes with some, burden because you have to take your source code and you have to replicate it in the cloud. You might not want to do that.
Sure.
Also, if you wanted to get the rich experience of code editing, then you also have to replicate your build environment and basically everything that it takes to compile those files. Mm-hmm. And while you might want to do that for other reasons, doing it to be able to share should be kind of an independent decision. And so what we wanted to do was to make it so that you could just take the code that you're working on locally mm-hmm. and share it with another developer. And what's the best way for that to happen? Well, it's actually more like a remote connection from your Visual Studio instance to your teammates.
Okay, so then the person that initiates the remote sharing session is the authoritative source.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, basically, the instance of the file that's on their machine mm-hmm. is the authoritative version of
right.
that.
Okay, so if I have Visual Studio 2017 on my machine, I have .NET Core 2.0, I've installed all this stuff mm-hmm. in order to do a Hello World.
Yeah.
And then you are elsewhere.
Yeah.
You have Visual Studio as well, but you don't have .NET even.
Yeah. All I could have is just like the most minimal install of Visual Studio, which has no workloads on it.
Like the 10-minute install.
The 2-minute install.
2-minute install?
Yeah,
okay,
the 2-minute install.
The base thing.
The totally core base thing is all I need to be able to connect my instance of Visual Studio to your workspace or project mm-hmm. and to be able to start doing co-authoring and co-editing and co-debugging.
So then I instantiate or I initiate a sharing session which creates this cryptographically significant URL, and I give that to you via something, Twitter, Slack, Teams, whatever.
Yep.
You click on it, and what happens?
I click on it, and if I have Visual Studio or VS Code installed, then it will open that session in VS Code or Visual Studio. If I don't, then it'll prompt me to download one of those tools.
Like via a web handler.
Yeah, exactly. So a web page comes up, and it basically says it's a web handler. It looks to see if you have one of these things on your machine, and if you do, then it opens it up and remotely connects to your workspace.
Okay. And I've done like remote debugging before.
Yeah.
Where like I've installed, like back in the day, like a long time ago, years ago, I would go onto a Windows server that did not have Visual Studio, and I would install the Microsoft debugger. And we'd usually have like a // share or whatever. You'd copy the debugger over there, you'd run it. Yeah. And it was just there to hook into Visual Studio's remote debugging. And Visual Studio remote debugging has been a thing for years, right? Like that's been built in.
The whole time. Yeah. I mean, very long time, like very long.
Right. Like when you go debug, attach.
Yeah.
You can attach to a running process
on your local machine, but you can also in some cases attach to a remotely executing process as well.
Is this like that?
It is very much like that, and it's actually built on top of that. So one of the reasons how we can enable the remote debugging capability is because of the remote debugging capability that we already had in Visual Studio. And one of the kind of coolest things about this whole thing is, the co-authoring capability, which allows both of us to type in the workspace simultaneously. That's one set of technology. And that's super interesting topic that we could talk about in a second. But the code debugging is yet another technology. They actually have little to do with each other. And the code debugging is basically just based on top of our remote debugger that we already have. And so one of the coolest parts about kind of getting to this point as we built up both of these capabilities in Visual Studio and VS Code is that we enabled the remote code debugging, and we did it for C#. And then all of a sudden it worked for a whole bunch of different languages. So we actually have a version that works for Python, for example. We didn't show it. We didn't demo it. As a side effect. Yeah. Just because that's how our remote debugger works, and it worked.
Did people know that Visual Studio was that nicely factored, that this was going to be a thing? Like the side effect would be like, oh wow, that is nicely, like the responsibilities of these components were so discrete and clean.
It was a very pleasant surprise with regard to the debugger. For co-authoring, it's a little bit more complex.
Sure.
And that involved a lot more refactoring of the code base.
So that's interesting. So there's two, this is really important to just it is holistically Visual Studio Live Share, but the debugging is one discrete thing that is very unique and not the same as if you remember Etherpad from 15 years ago, 10 years ago. It's like the first time we ever saw two cursors within a single oh my God, you're moving your mouse. I can see your caret, Yeah. And now we take that for granted. Like if an app doesn't have that, the typing in the same text file on the web has almost become a commodity.
Right. Or even typing in the same text file in a file share location is also something.
It's actually interesting that you say that, because I remember the idea of locked files. I haven't actually thought about a file being locked on a share in years.
Yeah.
Like it used to be a thing. Like, oh, hey, Amanda, you've got that file locked. Can you close that so I can open it?
That still happens sometimes.
Yeah, but not that much. I was actually on my iPhone recently. I opened up Word.
Yeah.
Which apparently no longer impresses me, although I should be amazed every time I do it. And they share a huge amount of the C++ code with the actual Word. So when you run Word in the iPhone, it's effectively the same Word that you run on your Windows machine. And it was like, oh, Amanda's also in this file.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, weird. Okay. And I scroll down and there you are.
Yeah.
I'm on my iPhone and I'm watching you type.
Yeah. Same thing for code now.
So same thing now for code for Visual Studio.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back to the remote person in the example that we're giving has no additional kind of workloads. We say workloads. That means they don't have Python. They don't have they don't even, if I went to the command line and typed .NET, nothing happens because it's not installed. How would you then get IntelliSense? How would you get refactoring? How would you get right-click, go-to definition? Those are things that would have to work.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, in some ways, you might think that you could take a technology like, Office 365 and, hey, that looks like text editing. And, hey, code is text. Can't we just take the, Word collaborative editing experience and say, that's now the basis for the code editor for Visual Studio.
Right.
And all of a sudden you enable collaboration.
Right. And we've seen other text editors and IDEs do similar type things, which is typing in the same sheet.
Yeah, but you can't really do that with code. And the reason for that is that, while you could do that if all you were looking for was like basic colorization, right? But what you really want is a semantic understanding of all of the code and how it relates to each other, right? And to do that, you actually need to have an understanding of multiple files that your code has a dependency on, so that you can do the build, so that you can do the semantic-based, navigation, like peak definition or go to definition or something like that, or refactoring, things like that. And also IntelliSense depends on this. So you need the multi-file understanding. And so one of the things that makes Visual Studio and VS Code so good is that we've been working on the compilers and kind of having a very, very, and Roslyn, and OmniSharp, as you know.
Roslyn being the open source C# compiler, and OmniSharp being the ability to use any editor to get IntelliSense on any platform.
Right. So part of the basis for our compilers is that they have this notion of decompilation and recompilation, right? So that if somebody has a program that they're writing, that it's always, we try to be as in a high of a compiled state as possible so that we can give the best tooling experience to the user. If you make an edit, then it basically decompiles that, method body, or basically that kind of block of code that you're writing. And then it recompiles it.
And it swaps it out?
It basically, it's in, compilers, there's this notion of ASTs, but basically it devolves the AST into a lower state. And then it has to recompile and look at all of the dependencies again.
So an AST is an abstract syntax tree. And if I've got a file with 5 or 6 functions and I'm editing function number 3 and I type, you said that it decompiles and then recompiles. Why doesn't it just throw away that one and then
just because compile? The perf would not be very good. So for us to get really great perf in our code editors, we need to have everything as high a compiled state as possible, so that we can give you good IntelliSense and as you type squiggles and stuff like that.
So the idea that when people explain naively, for lack of a better word, how Visual Studio does its thing, they think, oh, well, as you're typing, it's compiling everything.
Yeah.
That is a simplistic view.
It's kind of decompiling and recompiling just the part that you're editing and the dependencies that the part that you're editing
It's a pretty sophisticated delta.
Yes. Yeah. And we've, been working on refining it for years and years and years. But here's the thing that's really interesting about what LiveShare does is it makes it now so that you could have multiple cursors, right? So you could be in one part of the file or even in a different file that has
in a
different
file.
You could be, but you could be in the same file in a different function. I could be in that same file in a different function.
Oh, okay.
We can both make edits at the same time, and both of our dependencies end up decompiling to that earlier state and then recompiling.
Okay, so that gets interesting. So if Roslyn and the way that the system worked was fairly synchronous and not reentrant, you could get into some trouble.
Yeah.
But you're saying that it works. I could have 2 or maybe even 3, 4 people in there doing this, and it's smart enough to handle it. But who's doing the work? The machine that initiated the session does all the work.
Yes. So what happens is basically you are making an edit, and that edit is being remoted to the host's machine.
The host, yeah.
And the host's machine is doing all the compilation locally, but we had to augment and enhance the language service, which is another word for the compiler, the as you type compiler.
Right.
And make it so that you could have 2 cursors that could make an edit simultaneously.
You mentioned something in a kind of a throwaway comment I want to back up to, where you said to get things like syntax highlighting.
Yeah.
If the guest machine doesn't know about C#, who did the syntax highlighting? How did the text get colored?
The syntax highlighting specifically?
Yeah, well, making things bold and making things the right color, and then
so there are different. Now you're really getting I'm going to get super compiler geeky on you.
Let's go. I'll do my best.
Okay. For syntax coloring, there are basically different levels of syntax colorization that have different levels of understanding of the semantic basis of the code. So one of the things that you might see at some point is that you get basic colorization for a language like C#, but there might be some things like class names that might not be colorized immediately. Right? And so, so you can have a basic colorization for a language that understands the grammar, which is basically this. Okay, am I getting?
No, this is perfect. Let me. I want to make sure that I understand. So let me stop for a second. If I was going to go into like another text editor, let's just say Sublime, and someone opens up a C# file, and they look at it, and like everything's a nice, attractive color, and it's in a theme, and they might look at that and go, I got syntax highlighting. I got colorization.
Yeah.
That might be just a series of regular expressions underneath.
Yeah.
But then they open it up in Visual Studio and they also get coloring and they go, look, it's the same.
Yeah, but to be able, but see, this is where us compiler geeks get super nerdy. Is like you might get syntax coloring, and you might get grammar checking, like for the formal language.
Okay.
But you won't get semantic analysis, which means that you might, like if you think about a language could have, I don't know, 6 different colors in your code editor based on the different parts of the program that you're writing. That 6 is the maximum.
Okay.
If you had a not very good understanding because it was just based on regular expressions and syntax analysis, then you might only see 3 of those colors.
Okay.
Right? But then as your understanding progresses, then you could see 4 colors and 5 colors and 6 colors, right? And so each of those different levels of analysis represent kind of a more sophisticated type of language service.
Would you say, without necessarily insulting our listeners, would you say that we, the users of these things, might make things, we might oversimplify things. We like that, like, you know, everyone who's listening has opened a file, like a JavaScript file up into Sublime, and they go, oh, look, it's got syntax highlighting. And that's enough to impress. Yeah. It's enough for me to go, oh, wow, cool.
Well, I mean, especially when you're looking at stuff from a demo perspective, like, you know, you see it on a screen and you're like, whoa, okay, that's blue and that's, you know, light green. Like
suddenly Sublime knows about C#.
Yeah. Like, this is awesome, right? Like we have color check, colorization check. But one of the reasons why I love working on developer tools is that like developer tools are an 8-hour-a-day product, right? Like our users use them all the time, day in, day out, right? Yeah. And in that mode of use, it's those little things that really, really matter in terms of your satisfaction with the product. And so while a demo might end up, you know, giving you the impression that something has colorization, you know, you won't know until you actually use it that it's missing a whole host of features that you really need. It's
interesting that you say that because there was someone, I got in an argument once recently at an open source conference where someone told me that Sublime invented IntelliSense and Microsoft stole it. And then we had this big, long conversation, and basically they had misunderstood what IntelliSense meant, and they were confusing it with autocomplete. Yeah. So I went into Sublime, and I typed a big, long word, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and I misspelled it. And then I started typing super, and Sublime was like, oh, I know that. I've seen that before. Word. I will type it again for you. Yeah. That's not IntelliSense. Right. IntelliSense is typing this and hitting period. Yeah. And then a magic happens. It's basically the as you type, the completion is being pre-validated for acceptable things so that you don't type something that's incorrect for the program. Right, exactly. And that's why people who use TypeScript like it, because it makes JavaScript more fun and less dangerous. Yeah. Because of that a priori. Makes JavaScript less of a foot gun, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then back to Visual Studio Live Share, I'm on the guest machine. I don't have C#. I type var I equals whatever I dot. Yeah. How could you possibly give me a list of autocompletes on the var? You don't know the type of I yet because you don't have that compiler locally. You couldn't give me the list. Who does that work?
So what happens is your edits get remoted to my machine, and then the language service on my machine that has all the context of what that program needs to compile, basically there's an API call that happens that would populate the statement completion or the IntelliSense and give that back to your machine and show it in your machine.
As I'm typing.
As you're typing.
Boom, boom, boom,
yeah.
boom.
Yeah. That's crazy. It's pretty cool.
Okay. So that gets me thinking about like the levels then more, because I was thinking, all right, well, it's got syntax highlighting, coloring, check.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, oh, well, I can edit and co-edit in the same file, check.
Yeah.
But when you take it to a more, like you say, an 8-hour-a-day job, I need to be able to explore anyone's files. I want to see the files view, the solution.
You want to see
view.
anything that the code that you're writing might have a dependency on.
Right. Not necessarily just what the person's looking at.
Yeah.
And then IntelliSense. So then beyond IntelliSense or statement completion, there's things like go-to definition or even like a refactoring. Like if I want to select a bunch of text and then right-click and say extract method.
Yeah.
The host also does that work?
Yeah. So basically what would happen is as you type, we will be able to, I shouldn't say we, because I oftentimes think of Visual Studio is we. Like I am Visual Studio.
It's your team,
I am not Visual Studio, but.
No, you wrote it all entirely yourself.
I sometimes need to remind myself of that. So as you type, Visual Studio basically remotes all of that to the host's machine so that you can get, light bulbs and squiggles and IntelliSense that's grammatically correct and semantically correct, so that you really don't have to make a mistype. Is
it a direct connection? Like if you or I are in this, like I'm VPN to the same company, are you talking to some port that I have to like prompt the firewall to open up? And then if I'm at my house and we're not on VPN, are you routing it through some NAT traversal technique?
Yeah. So basically if the initiation has to go through a service that we host, but then after that, then we do have the capability for it to go via a relay kind of thing. There is like you do need to open that up so that you can have that direct communication
just
channel.
like when I did remote debugging, I had to open the port to initiate the remote debugging.
Yeah, you don't have to go like open a port specifically, but basically you'd get a prompt like Visual Studio wants to access this thing. Like, are you okay with that?
And is this like HTTP or is it magic binary thing or is it like WebRTC or WebSockets?
It doesn't matter so much at this point.
But my firewall is not going to like find it suspicious. It's just like Skype doesn't find Skype suspicious or
yeah, right. It's basically just the implementation, channel for the two remote sessions.
But then how does it work on Visual Studio Code, which is written in JavaScript and runs on Linux and Mac and whatever, and it works on Visual Studio, which is a big giant Windows application?
Yeah. It's basically a service that runs alongside your Visual Studio or VS Code, and the client invokes that service.
Okay. And the service is running right now in Azure somewhere.
Yep.
And I guess people are signing up for previews. They can kind of get their name on a list.
Yeah.
And then you'll use the number of signups to get a sense of how to scale this thing out so that millions of users use it.
So what we're really trying to do, so anybody can go to aka.ms/VS Live Share and give us their email address and a little bit of information. What we're hoping to do is to open up a preview in the early part of next year, very early part of next year, and get a diverse set of early alpha testers, essentially. We need people with different network conditions. We need people with different languages and tools combinations. We need people with different scale of their project sizes, so that we can make sure that we're building an experience that developers really love. And so what we're hoping to do is to kind of get a small group to start, and we'll ratchet it up over time. And it will, the selection will be based on the diversity of this set of people that we need. We need more Node developers. We need more C# developers. We need more people with this kind of network condition. We need people in this region. or we need remote teams that are,
the remote team thing is huge because my team is remote, right?
Yeah.
I'm in Portland, Maria's in New York, John's in San Diego. We're all over the place. And sometimes, I'm at a cafe and I've tethered my phone.
Right.
And it might be LTE, but it, might have some latency or whatever. It'd be super awesome if I could do that. And
Totally.
like John calls me and say, hey, can you connect in? And I just pick it up.
Yeah. And one of the things that we really need to make sure to get this right is that it has to be more reliable and robust than screen sharing, right? Because if you're going to go and, screen sharing it has to be better than screen sharing so you don't do screen sharing, right?
Yeah.
And so part of that is screen sharing has a lot of high bandwidth requirements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like if you're in a cafe tethered to your phone, sometimes you might be able to screen share, but sometimes you really aren't. And honestly, even within Microsoft, like even when we're entirely plugged in and we have one of the best networks in the world, probably, even then, sometimes we have some challenges with screen sharing technologies.
It's funny that you mention that because my Surface Book is like 3,000 by 2,000 or some stupid high resolution. And when I screen share from the cafe that I sit at with my phone tethered, I lower the resolution to like 1366 by 768 because I can't screen share.
Doesn't that suck?
No, it totally sucks.
That's horrible.
But then they'll go and say, oh, can I take over control, right? And they push that request control button or whatever. And then they always like, oh, the mouse isn't moving or I've typed and the thing hasn't updated yet. It's because you're pushing pixels around.
Right.
And they're JPEG-y pixels that you're shoving around the wire.
Right. And with this, it really is like one advantage just from the pure bandwidth and latency perspective. One advantage to this approach is that we're really sending only the minimum information that we need to power your code editing experience and the collaboration experience.
Right. What am I typing? Where is my cursor?
Yeah. So that's one major advantage. But the other one is that both of us can use the editor that I've personalized for my use, and you can use the editor that you've personalized.
So my hotkeys don't change.
Your hotkeys don't change. Your windows are all in the same places. If I go into debug mode and I have like, my favorite debug windows at the bottom, like you don't have to suffer through that as we try to debug a problem.
Okay, so that means my Solution Explorer is docked where I want it to be. My fonts are my way. Nothing changes.
Nothing changes. It's your user experience.
Has there been any thought to the specification of the protocol and like making it a thing that we put out there in the world and publish it, and then maybe some Emacs person might go and implement that so then an Emacs person can
possibly.
do that?
I mean, basically there are two different pieces of technology that we're talking about here. So there's the co-authoring portion of it, and then there's the code debugging portion of it.
Okay.
The code debugging portion of it is based on the Visual Studio Remote Debugger, which it's not currently an open protocol.
Okay.
The co-authoring portion of it is basically an extension of the language service protocol that VS Code is kind of based on top of. Mm-hmm. And so, it would be extending that.
Okay. So then theoretically, maybe the internet could get together and make at least the basics like a thing that we all standardize on, and then the more advanced things would be, like I said, a separate thing.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
So it's aka.ms.
aka.ms.
Also known as .ms.
Also known as .ms / VS Live Share.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
And theoretically, after the holidays, shortly after the holidays.
Well,
basically when you get back from vacation.
Yeah, essentially we didn't want to do it over Christmas because our team wouldn't be there to support everybody through.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
All right.
It was fun.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.